guys, I'm Scott from Fabian Liberty. Today I'm going to be doing a video on the myth of racial homogeneity in America, more specifically the Melungeons. If you like content like this or other things that look at psychology, sociology, and pop culture, as well as specific public policy from a libertarian perspective, then please check out our Twitch channel. We do gaming streams there, as well as our BitChute Minds, Locals, and Gab. Most of the content can be found both on Twitch and YouTube, but those other platforms, we're hoping to build and grow a community there. There's also a Discord link in the description if you'd like to talk to us, ask questions about the videos. So again, we're looking at the myth of racial homogeneity in America. Part 1, the Melungeons. So first of all, what is racial homogeneity? Racial homogeneity is the idea or the state of being homogeneous. It is the idea that races such as white, black, or even more specifically ethnicities like Irish, Italian, French, Dutch, etc., are are pure, or that they're completely together, that there's no outside factors. And in America, we have this idea, especially with all these increased racial tensions and discussions on race, that white people are white people and that black people are black people. And if you begin to really look into our history and kind of dig in to some of the subcultures and some of the things that have happened throughout American history, you'll find that there is a lot of interbreeding and a lot of intermarrying and a lot of subcultures that are, kind of different or offshoots or more racially diverse. And these groups have interbred and intermarried within larger society. And so we're going to be kind of going through several different larger subcultures or ethnicities within American history and kind of breaking apart that myth by giving some examples and going through their history.
Now I want you to, before I begin, to take a look at all of the pressmen before you. You will notice that not one of them are black. And they are going to have the nerve tomorrow to call me a racist.
So the first question you might ask is, why would we discuss racial groups in America, especially as libertarians? Wouldn't you want us to be colorblind, or wouldn't you want us to kind of ignore some of these racial tensions and talk about the things that are more important? But the thing is that it's in the forefront of the conversation today, and so we should address it. And so looking at mixed racial groups and their histories and tracking them through time really helps us kind of dispel, again, those myths of racial purity. And it also helps dispel some of the myths of racism itself. I mean, if one discovers that they are part African American or part Native American or have an Asian subgroup or are made up of multiple races, it kind of makes it more difficult to hate someone for their racial ancestry or for the subgroup or culture that they're in if there's some overlap between that and oneself. Also, we have to be honest about what America is. And, American racial history, I mean, you'll hear this from the left often in left academia, is kind of clouded by, a history that is written by the victors, right? A history that is written by a lot of, Southern Texas textbook buying practices and white individuals that may have denied their racial history in order to maintain reputation management and things of that nature. And so a lot of these things have been lost. A lot of this racial history is not gone. The information is there if you're willing to look for it, but it's kind of hidden behind a predominant narrative that isn't necessarily true. And one example of this, looking specifically at Melungeons going forward, the Melungeon Heritage Foundation, they claim to have records of over 200 different unique mixed racial groups in the eastern United States alone, right? So even though we may only look at a few racial groups that are kind of large, there are a lot of small pockets of racial groups that were mixed and then eventually spread out into the larger community and surfaced into the gene pool. And so America is not just a melting pot of cultures, it's a melting pot of races. And that's something that we need to talk about if we're going to be honest about racial tensions and issues moving forward in our country. Who are the Melungeons? Well, specifically, the Melungeons refer to a triracial group that was mostly in eastern Tennessee, southwest Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. This mixed racial group that you can see on screen are some photos of them. They were endogamous from the early 1700s to the turn of the 20th century. And so what this means is they mostly interbred and intermarried and kind of stayed within their own group until around somewhere in the late 1800s to around 1915. And they may have been there as early as the early to mid 1600s, but most likely as a larger group, not until the 1700s and mid 1700s. Now, because they were endogamous, they would have mostly represented, ethnic minorities. But as the Irish began to come in, they would have gained more and more white, kind of interbreeding and intermixing and intermarrying until they would have resembled most likely white individuals here in America. Knowing that the Melungeons in a lot of ways may pass as white or resemble white people that of darker complexion and some different traits, where did the Melungeons come from? Kind of what's their story, right? And so the Melungeons are made up of a large group of individuals, right? Triracial really doesn't give it its justice. What we know for a fact, at least what most researchers that have researched this know to be claimed to be true, is that they were made up of African Americans, Native Americans, and white Europeans. Now, the interesting thing is that most of the African Americans that would have been associated with the Melungeons would have been free people of color. And you wonder, why would there be free people of color in the Appalachian Mountains? What's going on there? And one of the possible explanations for that is that as black people gained their freedom in a racially segregated and often slavery system in the South, it wouldn't have been wise for them to remain in larger society. They would have faced harassment, severe racism. They might have been lynched. They might have been beaten to death. They might have been arrested for crimes they didn't commit. And so they were outsiders, ostracized from the society because they didn't fit within this kind of Herrenvolk democracy that we had in the South. And so they were pushed. Also, they had less money, and so they couldn't purchase good farmland. And so what would have ended up happening is they would be pushed towards not the greatest farmland in more dangerous areas on the borders of Native American territory. And so what ended up happening is a lot of free people of color ended up going towards these same areas that the Melungeons were in and becoming parts of those communities. Another interesting thing is some DNA evidence and testing was done in the 1990s in predominant from Melungeon bloodlines and from individuals that still identified as Melungeon and kind of tracing that ancestry back. And there was a surprising amount of Turkish, Portuguese, and Spanish DNA, most notably a large portion of Portuguese DNA. We don't have any explanation for this in terms of migratory patterns. And so what is very possible, though it seems somewhat outlandish, but the DNA evidence seems to show this, is that Portuguese settlers may have actually settled in the Appalachian Mountains long before Scotch-Irish or many people were even really in that area, so to speak. And so what may have occurred is that Portuguese settlers may have moved up to the Appalachians, interbred and intermarried, forming communities with the Native Americans there in lands that weren't necessarily highly populated. And then as the Scotch-Irish and free people of color and the occasional outsider or outlaw came to these areas, they already found a mixed race population that they could fit in with. Next, obviously, most notably, we have the Native American origins of Melungeons. These primarily consisted of the Cherokee and the Tusaugee, but also some Eastern Sioux or Siouan Native American tribes were living in this area. Because it was an outskirts area, again, and it was a mountainous region, there wasn't a lot of large tribes out there, so it allowed itself for more interbreeding and intermarrying. And then lastly, you had the Scotch-Irish displacement. From the very beginning of the founding of America and the American colonies, many Scotch-Irish were brought over as indentured slaves, and or indentured servants, however you want to say it. And then once freed, if they did live and free, they again would be pushed to the outskirts because they couldn't own or produce on good farmland unless they were sharecropping, which most of them did, but many of them chose to make settlements in the Appalachian Mountains. Again, with the potato famine and later migrations, more and more Scotch-Irish moved into the Appalachians if they moved to the South, because that's where a large portion of their family and ancestry might have been at the time.
Words are things, I'm convinced. You must be careful about the words you use, or the words you allow to be used in your house. In the Old Testament, we are told in Genesis that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. That's in Genesis. Words are things. You must be careful.
So one interesting thing to kind of look at is the etymology of the word Melungeon. Like what does that mean? The truth is, we don't really know. There's a couple of good guesses. The first guess would be mélange, which is French for mixture, though this population wouldn't have had a very large French literacy rate, but it does seem to fit very well with what we know of them and what the name and very close to the term Melungeon. The next one is a archaic English, which means an English word that has fallen out of usage, known as Melungeon. Melungeon means guile, deceit, or ill intent. It's a very negative word, and it at first kind of appears like maybe that wouldn't be it, but actually this is the word that most researchers believe the term Melungeon comes from. The last possibility, unlikely but worth mentioning, is Melungeon, which is a Kimbundu word meaning shipmate. And so this might be something that the Africans, that the free people may have spread around once meeting these individuals, but it's probably Melungeon. Some of the reason that we believe it may be Melungeon is some documents from both 1813, 1840, and some other primary source documents early on in the mid and early 1800s show that the term Melungeon was almost always used as an insult. You have to imagine these were southern areas of mixed-raced people before miscegenation laws were even invoked, because there wasn't really a need for it, because people were so racist at this time that they wouldn't even think to interbreed and intermarry unless you were doing so as a slave master with your slave, and then those would just be considered illegitimate. Of course, the Melungeons didn't simply stay put. They didn't simply stay in eastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, and some of the other areas of eastern and northern Tennessee. They moved, and they moved because of something known as the Great Migration. The Great Migration was the process from 1950s to 1915 to the 1970s of like an African-American migration out of the South. Due to racism, Jim Crow, and many other reasons, the construction of highways and things of that nature, blacks felt it necessary to move out of the South and kind of spread across America more. Now, this coincided with something known as the Hillbilly Highway. And the Hillbilly Highway was a phenomenon of many of this area that was heavily influenced by Melungeons, or heavily Melungeon, but also other individuals living in the Appalachians that lost their jobs in coal post-World War II and had no good work. And along with not having good work, again, you had all of these highways being built to all these other areas, and so they moved somewhere where work was available. So some of these areas included Dayton, Ohio, Cincinnati, Detroit, Youngstown, Ohio, all of these manufacturing bases in the Midwest, and other jobs that were available throughout the country. Specifically, however, uptown Chicago was known for an incredibly high amount of Appalachian people that lived in the Chicago area and kind of created their own ghettos. Some information from 1935 article in Detroit really showed how the corporations loved the hillbillies. And the reason they loved them was because they were very unlikely to unionize. And so these hillbillies would move from where they were, and they were just happy to have a good factory job. And they were very different culturally than the individuals that had been living in the cities for, 100 years now or more. And so what this shows is that this small pocket really mixed out at this point. So what you had was an endogamous society of mixed race individuals that was consistently getting a small influx of Scotch-Irish that have now moved all throughout the United States, especially the Midwest. And with that comes a kind of a whitening of these individuals, right? Because as they move to these new areas, they're no longer endogamous and they pass as white. They're mostly white looking. Many of them are even blonde. And now they're interbreeding and intermarrying with individuals. So when we talk about Melungeons, we're not talking about a small pocket of 20 people in the mountains that kind of spread out. We're talking about a very large mixed racial group that has permeated much of American society. Most notably, some famous Melungeons include Elvis Presley and Abraham Lincoln, actually from the same bloodline of Nancy Hanks. Now, when you look at these two individuals, it kind of almost makes sense, right? Like looking at Abraham Lincoln, there was always this idea that, well, he had Marfan syndrome, and that's why he was gangly and strange looking and darker. Well, that doesn't really make sense. What makes a lot more sense is that he was part Eastern Siouan, which were very, very tall and lanky people, and he was a Melungeon, mixed race with African American and Native American heritage, and kept these things hidden because that's what you did in politics in the 1800s. You lied. You might say that you were part Native American, but you would never admit to being part black. And it's kind of funny thinking of Elvis Presley, who gets so often accused of cultural appropriation and stealing from the blacks, to know that, well, part of his ancestry is black and part of his ancestry is Native American and possibly Portuguese. Some other individuals that you might know that are Melungeon is Cher, Ava Gardner, famous Hollywood actress, Tom Hanks, Fiona Apple, Bill Monroe, and Heather Locklear. All of these individuals are part Melungeon and have kind of descended from this triracial community in the Appalachian Mountains. That being said, if Abraham Lincoln was Melungeon, which the history records and just kind of the photo evidence kind of clearly show, is he the first black president? So now that we've kind of done like a brief history of who the Melungeons were and how they spread out and how they've become a part of larger society, like what's the implication of this? What does this mean? Well, first of all, it's just one piece of the puzzle that explains how racial purity in America is a lie. People say they're white. People say they're black. People say they're Latino. And unless your parents are first, second, or third generation immigrants, chances are you might have some Melungeon in you, right? A lot of American icons, even a president, possibly more than one, are part Melungeon and have some of this triracial identity within them. And it also shows how history is kind of colored by the bias of the people who write the history books and of the times and the culture of which the books were written. No one until, recently is going to discuss these racially ethnic groups that interbred and intermarried and quote unquote diluted the white DNA within America. And people would be ashamed to admit it. As a matter of fact, most people that are Melungeon, they don't even know that they're Melungeon. And their family often lied to them. They were told that they were part Native American. And that was the lie that had to be kept so that their family could maintain and own property or could move about society and eventually pass as white people. And eventually they, became mostly Caucasian. And the last thing is it kind of throws in the face this idea of race-based political ideologies in America. It's kind of stupid, right? When people say, well, you white people have done this to my family for generations, it's, you might be talking to a Melungeon. You might be talking to someone who was called a guinea and accepted being called a guinea because that meant people thought they were Italian, and it meant that the secret wasn't out that they were part black. And so these political camps and ideologies that spring forth trying to pit races against each other, if we begin to kind of look at some of the cracks in this narrative, we begin to realize that we are a racial melting pot in America. And so if you know anyone from any white people, that is to say, from Youngstown, Ohio, Dayton, Cincinnati, Detroit, or the Appalachian Mountains, or other areas that had large industrial jobs in the 1960s and 70s, they might be Melungeon. If you know anybody with the last name of Bolin, Bowling, Bowles, Bunch, Collins, Coffey, Dunham, Dunaway, Gibson, Goins, Goodman, Johnson, Kennedy, and so on and so forth, you may be speaking to someone that appears white, that has grown up in a white culture, but has been mixed with other things and may be a part of a really unique and awesome thing that we really only have as a history in America, where we are such a melting pot. And it's just kind of food for thought. And hopefully in the next video series, we'll go over some more racial groups and discuss more and more. You can kind of see how this myth of racial homogeneity in America is really built on a weak foundation that is a paltry look at the history of racial groups in America. If you like content like this, please like, subscribe, watch the videos if you get a chance, share them to people. Check us out on Twitch. We do the podcasts and these videos here, but on Twitch we have the podcasts and some gaming videos. We also have a Discord link in the description that's got all kinds of cool stuff in there. Just trying to build a community. We're on multiple platforms, and thank you for watching.